into the shadows, where I hope you find peace in the dark. These videos are handpicked week by week, and if you find yourself enjoying the content, make sure to bring your flashlight and leave a like, because it's always dark in the shadows. Without further ado, let's get into it. I only saw the old man who moved into the apartment next door once, and that was on the morning he arrived. He was polite enough, wishing me a cheerful good day, and he looked smart in a shirt and a bow tie combination that only gentlemen of a certain age can really pull off. His hair was thin and white, but not unkempt, combed neatly over in a side part. And then he was inside. The door was closed, and I didn't see him again. I certainly heard him, though. I mean, everyone's noisy sometimes, aren't they? You expect it in a place like this. The walls between these apartments are hardly thick, and I heard the young couple who lived on the other side before him occasionally, but they were quiet as a mouse in comparison. He made an awful lot of noise for such an old fella. He was always shouting. I presumed he was shouting at someone on his phone or TV, and that he was a little hard of hearing, perhaps. Maybe he was just shouting to himself. There were loud thumps sometimes, and I often became concerned that he might have fallen, but then the shouting would resume, and I figured he must have been all right. I had no idea what the hell he was up to, but I was able to sleep through it and decided it really wasn't any of my business. I resolved to ignore the noise as best as could, and kept one ear on it just in case I did need a call for someone. A couple of weeks in, I ended up knocking on his door anyway. In part, I wanted to make sure he was okay, but mainly I was there because I wanted to see if showing up in person would be what nudged him into keeping the noise to a respectful level. It had gradually gotten substantially louder, to the point that he was starting to wake me up in the middle of the night. When I knocked on the door, the shouting stopped, so I knew he heard me. He didn't answer, though. I knocked again, but after a few minutes it became apparent that he wasn't going to speak to me, so I went back, and as soon as I shut my apartment door, the shouting started again. The noise continued to get worse over the coming weeks. The thumps escalated into occasional crashes. The shouting got louder and more intense. I couldn't quite make out his words, but he was obviously very angry about something, and it was frightening to hear. Even more when one night he suddenly started banging on my wall. Now, I'm not a noisy person, I know this. I never listen to music without headphones on, and I scarcely even have time to watch movies. When I still lived at home, my parents often thought I'd gone out because of how quietly I sat up in my room beside myself, drawing or reading or whatever I was up to at that age. There was really no reason for him to be banging on my wall, and that's what just made this whole thing all the more scary. He was clearly irrational, and it crossed my mind that he might be having some sort of breakdown. I was worried about him, sure, but far more worried about the danger I might have been in. I was reluctant to call the cops, though, until at least I was sure I really had to. No one likes a snitch. I hung on a little longer. In a couple of short days, it all became unbearable. He was practically screaming now, yelling awful, vulgar words in a furious rage at the top of his lungs. The banging on the wall got louder and more violent to the point where I'm sure he was just throwing things at it. The impact made my pictures rattle and fall down on occasion, every now and then having to hang them back up. Last night, among the dreadful roars and the demolition job he was doing, apparently, he screamed my name. I heard the words, clear as a bell, and I went cold. The idea of all that rage being directed at me was simply terrifying. I didn't even want to think about how he knew my middle name. I hadn't used it for years. There and then, I called the cops. I almost didn't hear them arrive. I put my headphones on shortly after I made the call, so I didn't have to listen to the awful sounds coming from the other apartment while I sat there waiting for them. It was by pure chance that they knocked during a gap between songs. There were 2 officers, a young man and an older one, both of which had mustaches. I noticed the younger one did all the talking. He asked to double-check a few details first, so I told him when the noise started and what sort of sounds I've heard, how well I knew the tenant, and lastly, that I had very clearly heard him shout my name. I gave dates and times because up until this point I've been keeping a log of all the incidences that were warranted to my knowledge. He was very pleasant, thanking me for the call and reassuring me that there was nothing to worry about, but he kept repeating himself, a little incredulously. Are you sure the noise was from that side? For 4 weeks, and he definitely called your name. He was very pleasant, but I pressed him to find out why it was that they didn't seem to believe me, and he shrugged as he told me finally that they just couldn't fathom where the noise would be coming from. They had already gained entry to the apartment, you see, and found the old guy on the floor in the kitchen. He'd probably been laying there for about a month, likely since the day he moved in. He was dead. The younger cop carried on talking, but I was only half listening after what he had just said. I think he said the old man had taken a tumble and cracked his head on the way down, that there hadn't been anyone else inside. He said something about the smell. The officers went out into the corridor to do whatever it was they needed to do, and I just stood there with the door open, staring at nothing. My God, could I smell him now? I knew I had to get out of there, so I started packing as fast as I could. I wasn't sure where I was going to go, but decided to worry about that later, rather than spending another night in that place. The authorities busied around for a short while later. Some more people came to take the body away, and eventually they locked up the door behind them and left the old man's apartment empty. As I heard the ambulance pull away, the banging started again. If you liked tonight's video, please feel free, drop a like, leave a comment. It truly helps out the channel. It helps others get lost in the shadows as well, just as you have. And never forget to bring a flashlight. It's always dark. Have a good night.